When you look up at the skies near major airports around the world, you might sometimes get the impression that half the world is flying on the same plane. White fuselages, multicolored tails, but in fact it's still the same familiar silhouette of the good old Boeing 737 with two engines under its low wing. The paradox is that it was in the shadow of this extremely familiar giant that one of the most unusual and mysterious aircraft in modern military aviation was born. The RAT-55, officially designated NT-43A, this plane will be the subject of today's video. To understand why the RAT-55 is shrouded in such a dense layer of mysticism, we need to briefly return to where the story of the legendary 737 began, to the mid-1960s. By then, civil aviation was already firmly established. Large airliners like the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 took transatlantic routes, while airlines were increasingly exploring intercontinental travel. However, this progress had a downside. As long-haul routes grew, short domestic routes required a separate solution. Airlines needed an inexpensive, simple, and fuel-efficient aircraft for 1 to 2 hour flights between cities where runways were shorter, infrastructure was more modest, and passenger traffic was less stable. The European BAC 111 and the American Douglas DC-9 were already struggling to establish themselves in this niche. Boeing's position was becoming precarious. The company was literally torn between focusing on the successful 707 and 727 programs or taking a risk by creating an entirely new aircraft. The 707, 720, and 727 designs were extremely expensive and complex, making the launch of a new family seem like a potential financial disaster if the market didn't accept the product. But the interest of airlines in transporting 60 to 80 passengers on short routes more economically than the DC-9 outweighed the concerns of Boeing management, and the team got to work. This is how the project for a short-haul twin-engine airliner emerged, which would later receive the designation Boeing 737. When engineer Joseph Suter, the man whose name would later become famous around the world for creating the Boeing 747, was tasked with developing a concept for the future 737, he came up with a solution that would later be called brilliantly simple. Suter argued that the new aircraft should be as unified as possible with existing models, not only to reduce production costs, but also to facilitate airline acceptance. After all, the Boeing 707 and 727 assembly lines were already established at the time, and many elements, from the instrument architecture to the cable routing logic and control systems, could be transferred directly to the new aircraft. The idea wasn't revolutionary, but rather the construction of a reliable, affordable, and easy-to-maintain aircraft that would generate stable revenue for carriers. This decision defined the 737's appearance and technical philosophy. It inherited the 727's fuselage diameter, wide enough to allow passengers to board and exit faster than the narrow DC-9, and the 737 inherited avionics components from the 707. But perhaps one of the most daring ideas was the placement of the engines under the wing rather than in the tail. At the time, this decision was considered very risky, since the under-wing placement of the engines required a lower landing altitude of the aircraft and a well-thought-out installation of the landing gear. Nevertheless, Suter was confident that a lower-profile 737 would make its maintenance immeasurably easier than previous Boeing designs. Technicians would be able to dispense with tall stepladders, and baggage loading would be significantly faster. It was this philosophy of practicality and raw, down-to-earth functionality that became the core of the 737. The first model was the 737-100, launched in the winter of 1965. It was the most compact member of the family, and the first major customer to purchase these aircraft was Lufthansa. But its relative, the 737-200, which appeared in the spring of 1968, became exactly what people call the golden mean. It was longer than the earlier version, could accommodate up to 130 passengers, had improved aerodynamics, and was powered by the legendary Pratt & Whitney JT8D turbojet engines of the time, renowned for their ruggedness. They easily withstood temperature fluctuations, dusty stretches, freezing temperatures, and humidity, all of which made operating aircraft in remote regions extremely challenging. For airlines, it was a godsend, an aircraft that didn't require any fancy maintenance and whose cost per flight remained extremely low even with intensive use. The 737-200 spread like wildfire. It flew everywhere from the sparsely populated areas of Alaska to the scorching heat of Indonesia. The aircraft operated seamlessly in environments where many others would have simply collapsed. Moreover, it could easily perform 7 to 8 or even more short flights per day and quickly turn around between flights, requiring no lengthy maintenance. Once the industry realized what a reliable workhorse the 737-200 was, it quickly caught the attention of not only civilian operators, but also the military. The U.S. Air Force was experiencing a period when its Navigator training system was becoming obsolete. They were using T-29 aircraft, piston-engined aircraft based on the Convair C-131 Samaritan, which were no longer physically and mentally up to the demands of the modern era. The service desperately needed an aircraft capable of accommodating multiple workstations, training instruments, and instructor panels while remaining as safe and inexpensive to operate as possible. And the 737-200 was perfect for this role. This is how the military version of the 737-200, called the T-43A, was created, having received the unofficial nickname of Gator. This was an abbreviation of the word navigator due to the intended use of this aircraft by the military. The interior of the T-43A was completely redesigned. Instead of seats, it now featured training stations, tables, navigation instruments, and radars, and could accommodate 12 student navigators, 6 instructor navigators, and 2 pilots. In fact, the updated 737-200 became a huge air school and served faithfully in this role for decades. The T-43A's avionics were identical to those used in modern combat aircraft from the mid-1970s to the early 2000s. This included VHS Omnidirectional Range, VOR, Tactical Air Navigation System, TACAN, Long Range Navigation System, LORAN-C, Inertial Navigation System, INS, Radar Altimeter, as well as all necessary VHF, UHF, and HF communication equipment. However, soon after the advent of GPS, navigator cadets stopped being trained in celestial navigation, or LORAN. Yet the most surprising thing was not so much the fact that the T-43A appeared, but the subsequent fate of one particular aircraft. Among all the training aircraft, there was one that was destined to be sent into storage, then undergo a rebirth and return to service, no longer as a flying classroom, but as a unique flying laboratory, better known by the code name NT-43A, or Radar Airborne Testbed, RAT-55. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, stealth in the United States was no longer purely experimental. The Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk was already participating in combat operations, the iconic Northrop B-2 Spirit was undergoing intensive testing, and engineers clearly recognized the need for ongoing measurements of radar signature in real-world conditions. Stealth itself was never some kind of alien coding. It was a complex interaction of materials, vibration, temperature, speed, angle of attack, weather, and even storage conditions, recalling the specialized hangars of the B-2 Spirit. Ground tests of stealth technology were good, but the military increasingly needed a flying laboratory that could serve as both a radar station and a scientific complex at an altitude of several kilometers. Engineers needed a new testing method, or better yet, someone who could fly alongside a stealth aircraft, studying its characteristics from different angles and in different modes, literally under a microscope, and then record all changes in the aircraft's radar cross-section, RCS. This is where the idea arose to use one of the T-43As in this role, which were large enough to accommodate almost any complex equipment, possessing an obviously enormous margin of safety and impressively low maintenance costs. Because when you're measuring another aircraft's RCS, it's crucial that your aircraft behaves as predictably as possible in all weather conditions. The T-43A was sent for a thorough overhaul, after which it was transformed from a routine training aircraft into a machine whose appearance raises many questions, even among experienced aviation observers. With its enormous nose cone, seemingly overweight even for its size, its massive tail structure, and its many antennas, protrusions, and oddly shaped sensors, the RAT-55 is designed to measure the radar signature of stealth aircraft in flight in minute detail. Of course, there are ground-based signature evaluation capabilities, like the Dynamic Coherent Measurement System, DICOM's radar range at Groom Lake. However, they can't see every side of a stealth aircraft in flight, especially the top, which can be detected by roving enemy fighters and airborne early warning aircraft. But the RAT-55 certainly could. Interestingly, even after routine repairs are completed, the B-2 Spirit's usually required to spend some time in the air with RAT-55 to ensure that the work performed meets the established design goals. Although this is probably the most visible part of the NT-43A's work, because this mysterious aircraft is mainly involved in the most advanced and classified American stealth aircraft development programs in the Pentagon's portfolio, many of which we will most likely never know about. Despite its venerable age of over 50 years, the secret RAT-55 still has a lot of work to do, given the fact that the Next Generation Air Dominance program to create 6th generation stealth fighters and the development of the Northrop B-21 Raider strategic stealth bomber are getting closer to their logical conclusion and subsequent entry into service with the U.S. Air Force. Even if the current carrier, codenamed RAT-55, decides to retire, the service will certainly have a couple of T-43As in its arsenal that could be of considerable use in developing stealth aircraft programs in the coming decades. Not to mention that today we've confidently entered a new era of so-called great power competition, in which RAT-55 apparently risks being overwhelmed with work like never before. Do you think Boeing will reveal any details about its unique aircraft, at least in the next 20 years? Share your opinion in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell for more content like today's. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.